The quiz tool in Moodle can be used for a variety of purposes. It has an automatic grading capacity for the types of questions that can be assigned a correct answer, so multiple choice, true, false, matching, things of that nature. In addition to that, it can also take essay questions that you can then manually grade. However you want to use it, whether it's for drilling type formative assessments or for summative exams at various points throughout the semester, there are a number of settings to keep in mind as you work your way through the quiz tool. One of the important things to also wrap your head around is the concept of the question bank, because quizzes can be created from question banks, which gives you another tool in your toolkit, basically. The idea of randomizing questions or being able to select different balances of questions for different students, a whole wide variety of ways that you can utilize question banks. Now, the question banks in Moodle work a little differently than in some systems because every time you create a quiz, those questions automatically become a question bank in and of themselves, a bank named after the quiz itself. Or you can create questions for a question bank independent of a quiz. Whichever approach you want to take will dictate where you get started with this entire process. So the first thing that I'm going to do is turn editing on. Now, if I wanted to begin with questions in a question bank, I would come over here to the course administration menu. I would open up question bank, where I could then have the opportunity to create categories that my question banks live inside of, create the questions themselves, or import questions from another course site. If I wanted to get started with a quiz, I would come to the Add an Activity or Resource and would then choose the quiz tool. Now, creating a quiz involves two sets of settings. The first of those are the settings for the quiz itself. So these are things like what's it called? Will you have a timer? When will it become visible? All of those kind of things. And the second set of settings has to do with creating the quiz questions. And these are two distinctly separate processes. And part of that is because of the existence of the question banks. There needs to be a method for creating questions independently of a quiz. Most people create a quiz. Start with a quiz, create questions, move on. In this video, we're going to take that approach, and in subsequent videos, we'll show you how to use the question bank. So to start, I'll click on Quiz, and I click on Add. And I'm going to go ahead and expand all the settings so that we can see everything that there is to do. And I'm going to name this quiz, and I'm going to name this one Quiz 3. I could have a description here that may or may not show up on the main course page, depending on what I'd like to do. This is the reading quiz for week 3. You may take it as many times as you would like. Only the highest grade counts, and so on. Whatever else you want to put in there, whatever kind of things. And just for the sake of showing you this, I'm going to go ahead and display a description on course page. A couple of things to remember whenever you're doing anything in Moodle, but I'll make it clear here too. Anytime you see a question mark, this allows you to bring up a help page that will show you what this means. This one's pretty straightforward, but not everything in Moodle is that straightforward. Timing. Now, there's a difference between timing related to when the quiz is open and closed and time limit, which is how long can students take the test. You can combine these, but ultimately the close date and time are going to take precedence over the time limit. So what I'm saying there is I could set this to open the quiz, and to do so I click Enable, and we'll say I want people to be able to take this quiz at 1 o'clock. This is 24-hour time, just so you know. So at 1 o'clock tomorrow, students can take this quiz. And zeros. Awesome. There we go. And I want the quiz to no longer be available, so I click on Enable. So I want to close it at 2 o'clock. And I may have some good reasons for that. Maybe class starts at a certain time. This particular time sequence doesn't make a lot of sense, but basically the idea is I only want there to be an hour in which this quiz is visible. Perhaps I'm doing that in order to limit the amount of time in which people might be messing around with this quiz. In reality, for a reading quiz, I'm going to say I actually want that to be available up until class starts. So we'll say 2 days later. So they have 2 full days to take this test rather than 1 hour. But inside of that, each time they take it, if I want them to be limited to only, like 10 minutes, I can do that. Now again, for a repeatable reading quiz, chances are a time limit is not going to make any difference at all, but I'm just going to set it here just as an example. Again, I need to click Enable. I can set time limits that are very long if I choose to. I can have 10 days before the timer goes off. The reality is that you can't have Moodle up that long. So, you can, but if you're not doing anything, if you're not actively taking it during that time, eventually your browser will time out and eventually Moodle will time out. So you're going to want to use time limits judiciously for things in which a time limit is an important part of meeting the learning goal that this quiz is going to either help the student attain or help assess whether or not they've attained it. So have a good reason for a time limit if you're going to choose to use one. Here, if this student were to come in at 13:55 on the 26th, so at 1:55 on the 26th of June, they will not have 10 minutes at that point because this time limiter takes precedence over the actual timer. This is important to know because what will happen is that the next thing here, what happens when the timer expires? So it's set to just submit them automatically, which is what you're going to want. That only applies if the timer has gone out, not if you have reached this point. So it's really important that students understand that if you have set a close date on it, they need to submit that quiz. They need to click the submit button when they're done. It's not going to automatically do it unless they've hit a timer and you've used the timer at that point. So that is the kind of details behind using the timing tools. All quizzes create columns in the gradebook automatically. If you've already started to set up your gradebook, then you can control some of what's going to happen with that column here. So if you already have categories, those will appear in this pull down. This is also where you determine how many times you want them to be able to take it. This particular quiz up in the instructions, I said they could take it as many times as they wanted, so I'm going to do that at unlimited, and I'm going to choose highest grade. Although I could choose average grade, or it could be a scenario where only the first attempt counts for a grade, but they can keep taking it for practice and to figure out what the right score is. That's a really good way to sort of combine a formative assessment and a summative assessment in the same quiz, that you want to make sure, you want to see what kind of knowledge they collected over time. So, it's a test, so that first attempt, that grade counts, but you want to give them the opportunity to go ahead and try again and maybe figure some things out. Perhaps there's a way that later you want to manually take that into account as part of your participation grade or something like that. So there are some really useful ways of using all of these options for grading with the unlimited attempts. So for layout, this has to do with how the questions show. Do you want them all on one page, or do you want a certain number of questions that appear on each page? There are some various ways to paginate things, but generally speaking, you're talking about all the questions on one page or one question on each page, depending on what your purpose is. Navigation method has to do with how the students can move back and forth within the quiz. So if you have the quiz broken up over multiple pages? Are you going to allow them to go backwards into earlier points in the test, or is it sequential? Once they have completed a question on a page and move to the next page, are they done? They can't go back again. By default, it's all the questions on one page and free navigation because that's the most common way that people use the quizzes. But in this particular case, you'll want to think that through if there's some method that would be useful here. And again, clicking on these will allow you to look at some more help information. And this is where it lets us know that even though you can set this to be like every 2 or 3 or 4 or 8 questions, there are ways to manually paginate later once you have questions in. So this is just kind of a default. And then once you have questions, you can set page breaks. In case you have one question you want to stand on its own, and then subsequent questions in groups of 3 or 4, and then maybe another question that stands on its own, things like that. All right, question behavior. This has to do with how, obviously, the questions behave. Do you want to shuffle the response options within each question? By default, that's set at no, but you can change that for each individual question as you go once you start adding questions. If most of the time you want them to be shuffled and there's only a couple where the order matters, you could change this to yes and it'll shuffle within the questions. Most of the time you do not want them to shuffle, leave it at no, and then you can change the specific ones. How questions behave. So this has to do with how you handle allowing the test to be taken multiple times and what you would like them to be able to see as they work their way through. Do you want immediate feedback? So you're going to enter some automatic feedback that will appear. Do you want them to see it as soon as they have put a response in for a question? Or do you want to wait until later after they've completed the exam? Do you want the quiz to be an interactive quiz with multiple tries? So that usually gives you that's a combination of things with immediate feedback and some adaptive mode and things like that. Do you want the quiz to be entirely manually graded? Most of the time, this is the standard, just deferred feedback. They don't see anything until they have submitted the test. But I am going to urge you to take a look here at the way they interact with questions. Deferred feedback mode is described right here. You may wish them to submit each question, get feedback, have another chance if they didn't get it right. This would be interactive with multiple tries. Those are the 2 most common, but you can click here on More Help, which will pull up this page, which will now give us the full detail on all of these. You would not want to set the entire quiz to manual grading if you had multiple choice and true-false questions, things that you would normally want to have automatically graded, because this forces it into a manual grading setting for everyone, every question. So I'm going to urge you to look through this because some of these things with the adaptive modes, particularly the interactive with multiple tries, are very good if you want to use a quiz not to determine how much they know, but to give them the opportunity to use a quiz as a studying method. There's been a lot of research that shows that an extremely effective method of studying for a test is self-testing. And this is a way to set up a good self-test. You can, this conditional questions, it's a little complex to work through, but it is possible to do what are called conditional questions. So if you've got multiple tries, immediate feedback set to free, you can make a question dependent on the previous question having already been answered. That's not necessarily going to control whether it was right or not, but it's like you can't see it until you've completed prior questions. And this might be useful if you have a question that would, a later question that would give away the answer to a prior question. This is useful if you have, for instance, a small data set or a graph or an image or something, and you're asking a series of questions, and each question kind of builds on the prior question, which means if they looked forward, they would see what the answer is to an earlier question. So that can be useful under that circumstance. And I'm going to close out this help menu, and that will allow us to get back into the settings. Each attempt builds on the last. So in this scenario here, if you're letting them have multiple tests, the prior quiz would have what they did before. So this would allow them to only, retake the questions that they got wrong rather than redoing the whole quiz. So if you want to change that so by default it's no, they have to retake the whole quiz if you let them take it more than once. But you can change that to yes if you only want them to go back and correct the ones that they didn't get right. Next up is review options, and this is what do the students see. During the attempt needs to be turned on and will automatically become turned on. Right now it's grayed out. If you've changed this off of deferred feedback. So if this is set to deferred feedback, then this is automatically grayed out. You can't choose to let them see anything during the attempt. But if you've got this set to some form of immediate feedback, they will see these things in the quiz. Immediately after the attempt means when they've hit the submit button. If you would like them to see their attempt, whether or not answers are correct, marks is just the word used in Moodle for points. And then if you have entered in some specific or general feedback, do you want them to see the correct answer? Have you entered in any overall feedback? A lot of this is grayed out unless you've allowed the attempt to be viewed, and then the other things are ungrayed. Later, while the quiz opens, means that they have submitted it, but all of these things won't appear immediately. They'll only appear if they go back into the quiz at some point, but the close date hasn't been hit yet. And finally, after the quiz is closed, this is if you don't want them to be able to look at the quiz until the quiz is completely closed. This is useful for when you're using the quiz tool as an actual exam. If you don't want students to be able to open it up, see correct answers, and share those with another student, you'll want to make sure that you've set a close date and choose these as the options for after the quiz is closed. If you're going to be using the quiz more as a practice, self-testing, or mastery process, then you're going to want to deal some with how the questions behave, deal some with how often they can take it, and you're probably going to want to set some things up so that they can see them immediately after the attempt. Appearance, I don't think this is this is not really particularly of any importance. How many decimal places do you want? Do you want their picture to show? Just stuff like that. Extra restrictions on attempts. Now this is important if you've allowed them to take multiple attempts. Do you want to place some restrictions on that, such as forcing them to take half an hour to study again before they take it again, so that they're not just, particularly if you're only making them retake the questions that they got wrong, they could just, if they can immediately go back into it, they can just brute force, trial and error until they get it right. Maybe you want to force a little time delay in there so that they take some time to go look up correct answers, if that's part of the purpose of the test. These feedback options here in this part of the settings are only deal with the entire overall feedback. And this is stuff like you could set a grade boundary. So let's say you're using mastery-based learning and you're asking the students to make at least a 90% on each quiz before they move on in the material. You could set that to 90, so the grade boundary of 90, and say, great, you've hit a 90, you're welcome to take the quiz again if you would like to, but you are now able to move on to additional material in the course, something like that. And then down here, so between 0 and 90, it's you need to retake it because you haven't hit my mastery level yet, and 90 up, actually this is going to be between 0 and 89.99999, but you get the point. 90 and up, you can say that. So this is really important if you're using mastery grading with the quizzes. You can set up as many of these overall feedbacks as you'd like. They could be used for more than just mastery grading. Maybe they're only allowed to take it once, but you want to say something to them if they scored less than a certain amount, something along the lines of, you're going to want to go back and look at this material and this material. Maybe if you have it set up so if the student failed, a message appears that tells them to contact you and, because you want to talk a little bit about it, and that you may provide them with some opportunities for retaking, stuff like that. So it can be used as a way to automatically communicate with the students. And if you choose language that is affirming and reassuring, but pretty clear if they haven't done as well as you've expected them to do, that will encourage the students to not just say, fine, I failed and move on, but to actually do something more as a result of that. Common module settings. The primary thing that's of importance here is if you are using groups in your course. So, for example, maybe you have a single site in which you've merged two sections of one, and you have one, section A and section B, and you've set those up as groups, and maybe only section A needs to have access to this course, you can use the group mode to control that. Now that restrict access, there are some restrictions that can be placed. It's actually easier to handle restricting access to a group of students this way than it is with this. So I'm going to just say at this point you probably are not going to need to deal with groups or anything in this particular segment. Restricting access allows you to control who can see the quiz or take the quiz. There's a lot of different ways to do restrictions. Date, but there's no point in that because the quiz tool itself already has date control, and I'm going to urge you not to use date in the restrictions. Use it up there in the course timing. Grade. What this would mean is they can't take this quiz unless they've made a certain grade on some other item. So completion tracking is turned on for courses. That allows you to, for new courses, not for old courses, that's going to allow you to say, okay, there's a certain grade they need to make on something prior to that. Here's how you would control by group. Rather than using the grouping in common module settings, if you have groups and you want to only allow certain groups to have access to the quiz, you'd use that here. User profile. This allows you to set a quiz up with like a student's name, like only John Smith can have access to this quiz. Release code, that would be the case if you had some sort of a password that you wanted to give students who had accomplished certain things. And then you can actually have a nested restrictions. You can make this really complicated if you want to. Probably not much point in that, but you can. Tags, this is if you have hundreds of quizzes and you want to create some tags so that it's easier to search for them. Probably not necessary. And competencies, this is only if you've used the course competencies tool within Moodle to set up what your course goals are or course competencies are, and then you can flag this test as meeting certain competencies. Again, you're probably unlikely to be using this. So I'm going to go ahead and just save this quiz and return to course. And in my next video, we'll work on questions. Now, interestingly enough, there we go. It didn't save. The reason it didn't save is because I put something in there, so it's expecting something, some feedback to be placed. Now, when I click on save and return to course, it saves. Here it is. Here's that description that I checked the box to make it appear, which allowed me to put some instructions here. And with that, I will end this video, and in the next one, we will explore creating questions in a Moodle quiz.